Hey everybody, Ryan here at etrailer. Today on our 2019 Ford F350, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install the Airlift wireless air compressor system. So an air compressor system is going to do a couple of different things. It's virtually going to eliminate any maintenance, and it's going to allow us to quickly and easily adjust our airbags according to whatever load that we might be pulling behind the truck. So what I think is really cool about the wireless compressor system is that it's going to work from a pretty good distance outside of the truck. And what this is going to allow us to do is, say we're hooked up to our trailer, we can make our adjustment, compressor will kick on, and it's really easy to eyeball and see if we're sitting where we need to be. And we can make an adjustment up or down right here, as opposed to having to get an air hose, fill up air in our bags manually, take a step back, look, keep going back and forth, making an adjustment. This is way quicker and more convenient. So this is what the compressor is going to look like. In our situation, it's kind of unique. Our customer actually wanted his to be mounted inside of his toolbox here in the bed of the truck. But that's what makes this setup great, is how versatile it is. It's all going to be combined in one unit, and it's going to have a really nice mounting bracket with several holes in it to make mounting it somewhere very easy. And since it is so compact, you're really going to have a ton of different options. You can mount it on the side of your frame rail, you could put it in the bed, you could set it up here in a toolbox like this. Really, your options are going to be endless. One of the things that really separates this wireless compressor from some of the other ones is how responsive it is. With this one, you can increase the air pressure, and it takes about a second to kick on, as opposed to some of the other ones where it really has to think about it for a while. You might change a pressure, and it might take 30 seconds, 45 seconds. It takes a while to actually kick on. In some cases, I've come across where you actually think it's not working properly. Some of them other compressors, you might hop out of the truck to figure out what's going on, and then it kicks on. Not with this setup. As soon as you make your adjustment, give it about a second or two, and it fires right up. But something I really like too is how simple it is to operate the remote. It's not complicated at all. It's really straightforward. If we look at the remote, we're going to have a handful of buttons. Down will lower the air pressure. If you push up, the center button, compressor will kick on and it'll make those adjustments. And the screen's going to tell us how much PSI is in each bag. We can inflate each bag individually. Say if you have an off-center load and need one side to be higher than the other, you push left, you'll see the arrow, and you're able to inflate just that bag. When both arrows are on each side, that's going to inflate them at the same time, both bags, which that's what you would typically use. And then you can go do the right one as well individually. So it gives you a lot of different options, and should work really good for you regardless of situation. Go ahead and lower some air pressure out of it. Then we're going to have 1, 2, and 3 here. And these are going to be presets. So this will work really good if you have a couple of different trailers that you know, you kind of know what pressure, you already found out what pressures work great for them. So for example, 1, that's usually what I recommend having as your maintenance whenever you're not pulling a trailer. Most bags require a minimum of 5 PSI. So that's usually good for that. And then that gives you 2 more options. So say your one trailer, you know 20 PSI is good. You simply come in, you don't even have to think about it. You just push 2 whenever you hook up to it, and it will automatically inflate it to that pressure that you saved it as. And it's going to be the same thing with that 3rd preset. Whatever number you save it as, it's going to inflate to there. Now what's nice too is you don't have to solely rely on this remote. What you can actually do too is download an app on your cell phone or your mobile device, and you can accomplish the same thing. You're going to be able to make adjustments and everything else right from your cell phone. So that's always nice. You're going to have that backup if you ever lose this or the battery dies, something like that. You're always going to have your phone so you're never going to have to worry about going without. So a big question we get asked in regards to compressors is if you have to pair them up with the same brand of airbags. And the answer is no. You can use this airlift compressor with any brand of airbag on the market. It's going to work just fine. And another one we get asked too is if you can have or use it with onboard air. So for example, some people would like to have a small air tank, that way they can fill up their tires or whatever they're trying to do. With this being a dual path compressor, you are able to do that. One of the lines you would just have to run to your air tank, and that would isolate that air tank. And the other line, you would just go back to both airbags. So if you wanted to do that, you would lose your adjustability of each individual airbag, if that makes sense. So you could adjust your airbags at the same time. You couldn't do one side or the other. But the trade-off is now you would have onboard air. So in my opinion, really the wireless compressor system is going to be the only way to go. With how convenient and simple it is, how responsive it is, it just works really well. And with today's newer trucks, even if you were to want to use a traditional style analog type system where you have a gauge, it's going to be extremely difficult to find a good spot to mount it on the dash. These newer trucks have so much stuff going on, it's really difficult to mount those up. Now, as far as the installation goes, out of compressor systems, this is probably one of the easiest ones that I've done. And that's because the easy mount, the bracket's already there for you, the wiring's all put together, nice and easy and straightforward. Really shouldn't have any issues at all doing it at home, in the garage, or even in the driveway. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and hook it up together now. To begin our install, we're first going to need to secure our easy mount compressor. Now in our case, we kind of have a unique situation. Our customer actually wants it mounted inside of his toolbox, which is perfectly acceptable. But I'll show you how I did it in here, and then I'll show you a location where you would usually mount it instead of the toolbox. Pretty straightforward here if you're mounting it like so. The bracket that it comes with is going to have a bunch of pre-drilled holes and makes it really easy to find a spot. So what I've done is just drill the hole through our toolbox, through the bed of our truck, and then used the included bolt on each side to secure it down. So the spot that you would usually mount your compressor is along your frame rail, anywhere where it's nice and open. Usually in front of the rear wheels. You want to kind of get it as close as you can to the cab. Usually about where the bed and the cab of the truck meet is an ideal spot. Now we can grab our air filter. And on one side of it, we're going to have some threads. We're going to take this fitting. We're just going to thread this on by hand. Really no need to crank down on it because the filter is plastic. Let's get it snug. We're going to take the short piece of nylon air tubing that comes included. We're going to push this onto this barbed fitting. It will be kind of tight, but that's to be expected. Now we can mock this up and connect the other end of our nylon air tube to the inlet on our compressor. So to actually secure your air filter, I drilled a 3/8 hole. This will just snap in. The other end of our nylon air tube will plug into this barbed fitting here on our compressor. This will work the same way as the fitting on our air filter. Just slides right over it. Now we can work on getting our electrical plugged in. So I took our main harness, and how I got it up into the toolbox is I just drilled a hole in the side of it, used a rubber grommet, and this wiring drops down to the underside of our truck. But with that being said, we're going to take our plug. It's going to plug right into the compressor. There's going to be a white tab. It's almost like a locking tab, so you push that down, make sure that's secure. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have a black and a red wire coming off of the compressor with some pre-attached ring terminals. And on our main harness, we're going to have a bare red and a black wire. So we're going to connect these two together, color for color. So instead of using these pre-attached ring terminals, what we're going to do is take the heat shrink butt connectors that come included with the kit and use these instead. So what I'll do is kind of trim these to length. You won't need all this extra wiring. I kind of cut these ends off. We'll go with about here for these two. I'm just going to strip back the insulation on all 4 ends of our wires. These wires that come directly off the compressor, they're a little bit thinner. So I like to strip off a little bit more, twist them, and kind of double them back over. And that way they'll just fit in the butt connector a little bit better. Same thing with these ends. We're just not going to double them over because these wires are thicker. The way the butt connectors work is really simple. We'll just slide right over one end of the wire. You'll crimp it down. Get one over the red wire as well. And we're just going to go color for color. So the red one, plug into the other red wire coming out of the compressor. And same setup for the black wire. Once I have all these crimped, since these are heat shrink butt connectors, you can come back with a heat source, warm up the ends, and that'll seal them up. And while we're up here, what I gone ahead and did was take our big bundle of nylon air tubing and cut it in half and ran it through that same grommet down to the underside of our truck. That way when we go underneath our truck to run our wiring, we don't have to come back up again and do our tubing. It'll already be down there ready for us to route. Now underneath our truck, we can route our electrical wiring. So right up here is where our wiring drops down out of our truck bed, and it comes down to the top of our frame rail. Then I actually just ran it to the outside of our frame rail and down along towards the front of our truck. So here's where our wiring came over to the outside of our frame rail, and I just followed some factory wiring all the way along. You want to be sure and do your best to avoid any hot or moving parts if you run your wiring differently. I just secured it using some of the zip ties. Just keep going. I went up and over this body mount through there. If you kind of peel your fender liner back, you'll be able to see the wiring. And what you're able to do is take a coat hanger or an extra piece of nylon air tubing, tape your wiring to it, and you're able to push it all the way up into the engine compartment. So now in our engine compartment, here's where our wiring came up. And what I'm going to do is just take the pink wire and kind of just set this aside for now. We're going to focus on getting our red and black wires hooked up. So these are going to go to our battery. I'll kind of route these down and over. We're going to first start with our black wire. So this, we're going to strip back the insulation. We'll take our blue ring terminal and crimp that on. This black wire is going to get connected to the negative battery terminal. So if we move to right here, we're going to loosen up this nut with a 10mm socket. Some of these nuts don't come completely off, at least not easily. And that feels like it's the case with this one. So instead of fighting it, what we're going to do is just take our ring terminal and just cut a small opening in it. About like that. What we're going to do is just slide our ring terminal underneath the head of the nut and tighten it back down. This will provide us with a good ground. Now for our red wire, do something very similar. Just strip back the insulation. Kind of shorten up that copper. We're going to grab the blue heat shrink butt connector. Slide that over the end and crimp it down. The reason we're putting a butt connector on right here is because we're going to attach a fuse holder. So this is what our fuse holder will look like. I'm going to open up the cap, make sure the fuse is not installed. That's the thing we're going to install at the very end of this installation. With that being said, we'll cut that in half. Strip back both ends. One end will go into the butt connector. The other end, we're going to take the yellow ring terminal and crimp that on. We're going to hook this up to the positive battery terminal. So instead of having to cut our ring terminal and slide it under that nut, what I think I'm going to do is remove this nut here on this stud. And that way we can put this down on there completely. So again, I'll grab a 10 millimeter. This nut should come all the way off easily. Which it does. Slide that ring terminal over. And we'll tighten that nut back down. And with all this in place, since we did use a heat shrink butt connector, come back with a heat source and seal up the ends. Then on the positive battery terminal, you can just take that rubber protector and put that back in place. Now we can move on to our pink wire. Now this pink wire is optional. You don't have to hook it up, but I always like to. And what this is going to do is tap into your fuse block. Whenever you turn the ignition to the on position, this wire will get power. And what you can do is set up your compressor to kick on automatically at a certain PSI. So say for example, if you want your compressor to keep 30 pounds of air in the bags and it falls below that overnight, next morning you hop in the truck, turn your key on, it'll automatically fill it up. So that's what this controls. Now the kit doesn't come included with the terminal here or the fuse tap or anything, so you will have to source that at your auto parts store. But what I did is just crimped on a terminal to our pink wire. And right here, I have a fuse tap. So this end is going to plug onto that. But first, we're going to take our fuse and put in it. So I found a 5 amp fuse from our fuse block. And I'll explain to you that in a minute. That fuse tab is going to slide over our fuse and plug the end of it in. Then we're going to plug our fuse into this slot. So what you're looking for, which fuse you want to choose, it needs to be 10 amps or smaller, and it only has to have power whenever the key is in the on position. And so this is really the only ideal fuse that I found that'll work. This actually controls the rain sensor. And I opted with that because say if the fuse does pop, if something happens, the rain sensor isn't the end of the world. You can still turn your wiper blades on manually. If you were to choose one of these other fuses that maybe have to do with your four-wheel drive or your PCM or some really important component, it's just better to avoid those. So with that being said, we're going to take our fuse tab, so on this side of the fuse, and I want to be sure to plug that end to the side on our block closest to the engine. That way it's still fuse protected. If you did it on the other side, power wouldn't run through the fuse to our compressor. That just pushes down in there right like that. Now we can move back underneath the truck and route our air lines. So here's where they drop down out of the bed, just like the wiring. We're going to run it towards the back of our truck where our airbags are. We kind of just zip tied it to some wiring along the way. Really want to try to avoid hot moving parts. I just ran it along this factory wiring here. It kind of went on the top of our fuel tank. So one of the lines I drop down right here, and it'll tee into this airbag line. The other line I just continue to run towards the back. And instead of routing it all the way over to the other airbag, I'm just going to tap a little further down into the line. So here's where the line for the right side or passenger side airbag comes. So I think what I'm going to do is just tee it in right there. So the way we're going to tee in our lines is with the included T fittings. So what we're going to do is take our airbag line, cut it in half, the T in, and then on that last port, plug in our line going up to our compressor. So what we'll do is make our cuts. And you obviously want to make sure that the air is out of your airbag system before you cut the line. And there's a trick to cutting these lines. You want to make sure that the cuts are nice and straight. So I'll go ahead and plug this in first and then show you how to make those cuts. So these are just push fittings. They just kind of snap into place. Give them a tug to make sure they're not coming off. So I'll kind of judge the length we need here. That way I can cut it. It's about there. So when you cut this airline tubing to plug it into your fittings, you want to use a tool like this or a utility knife, or we even offer air tubing cutter tools here at eTrailer. You can pick one of those up. You don't want to use a regular pair of snips because you'll pinch the line kind of, and chances of it leaking are pretty good. I'll cut that. I'm going to take a good look at it, make sure it's true and square and there's no burrs or anything like that. So that's a good example of how a clean cut should look. With that being said, I'll just plug it into the last remaining port in our T-fitting. So I went ahead and installed our other T-fitting on our other airbag, and this is the way it looks. Now back here at our compressor, we can plug in the other ends of our airline tubing. I just want to point out I did unplug our electrical just to make it a little easier to see. Once we have these plugged in, we'll reconnect that like earlier. But what you need to do is remember or identify what line went to what airbag, because the ports coming out of our compressor are going to be side specific. So this will be the driver or left-hand side of the truck, and this one will be the passenger side. So I know which lines go where. Make those cuts nice and clean, just like we have been doing. These will plug in the same way. Just push them right into there and make sure they're fully seated. Now that we have everything all hooked up, we're going to come back to our engine compartment and install our fuse into the holder. Now we can test our compressor, fill up our system full of air, and check for leaks. So grab a remote, it'll power up. We'll go ahead and put about 30 psi into our system. That way it's high enough to create or easily see any leaks if we have any. So what you're going to do is come down to all the connection points here. We're going to have two on our compressor and then all of our T-fittings. We're going to take some soapy water and just spray those fittings down. What we're looking for is any bubbles to rapidly be forming. If you see bubbles being rapidly creating, you know we'll have a leak and we need to repair it. In our case, it looks like we're all sealed up, so we're in good shape. If you did have a leak, you'd simply pull your line back out, cut a new edge on it, clean it up, and put it back into position and try it again. But with that being said, I'll go ahead and spray down all of our remaining fittings to check for those leaks. That'll finish up our look at and our installation of the Airlift wireless air compressor system on our 2019 Ford F350.